Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Taylor Jones from the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Thank you for being here. This is our webinar and presentation / discussion about the recently effective accessibility standards for electric vehicle charging stations. We are live here in Sacramento from the California Division of the State Architect, and we have about 20-30 people in the room, and we have lots of people on the webinar from all over the state of California, and I know a couple people maybe from other states, so that's really exciting too. So big thanks for joining us today. We're looking forward to this discussion. On the webinar, everything looks functioning on my end, but folks on the phone or webinar, if you cannot hear us or something is wrong, please just send me a message in the chat box. I will be monitoring that the entire presentation. So before we get started, we just wanted to lay a few ground rules for our discussion and our webinar participation process because we do have a lot of people remote. The first hour of our time together today will be focused on a presentation by Ida Claire and Derek Shaw from the Division of the State Architect. During the presentation, we're going to have 3 natural pauses for questions throughout, in which we'll take questions on what was just covered. And then at the very end, we'll have a long discussion for the however long is remaining, hopefully close to an hour, that we can take questions on the entire thing. So for folks in the room, because we do have a large group of attendees here and on the phone, we'll forego introductions for now, but if you ask a question, please just state your name and organization so we know where you're from. And folks on the webinar, we're going to keep everyone's voice muted, again, due to the large number of people attending. But if you do have a question, please type it in the chat box and send it to me, and we'll read it aloud for the room. We'll also try to repeat the questions in the room because the mics are only up here at the front, so you're welcome to come up and ask it or type it and I can repeat the question. If we don't get to your question, which I think will happen during this discussion because we'll have a lot of questions, whether they're site-specific or experience-specific, we will get to them later. So I'm taking down a list of all of the questions and we'll respond. I think all of us here hope that this, an outcome of this conversation is connecting all of you stakeholders with our office at GoBiz and the Division of the State Architect so we can, continue these discussions in weeks forward. So we'll try to get to everything, but if not, we will follow up later. Okay, so formalities complete, I would like to pass the mic to Tyson Eckerly. He's our Deputy Director over at the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development for Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure. Tyson will be our moderator for the day.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I think I want to remind, I think we're all aware, and I'm glad there's such great attendance, but we're here to try to meet Governor Brown's zero emission vehicle goals of getting at least 1.5 million ZEVs on the road, by 2025, and a big piece of that is the infrastructure and also accessibility for everybody and the driving public to be able to use it. And so that's a big piece of the puzzle of why we're here. And so we're excited. We have station developers, utilities, local officials, all coming with a similar perspective of trying to get there in the most cost-effective and straightforward way possible. We know that many of you, participated in that multi-year stakeholder process to help bring these standards, develop these standards. And now that they're in effect, our goal of today is really to focus on implementation, not kind of like opening the standards back up, but really like how do we work within what's been defined with those standards and implement them. And I think there's, based on the conversations we've had, there's been a lot of questions and confusion about, how to navigate throughout there on the ground. And so we're hoping we can answer a lot of those questions today. We're thankful we're partnering with the Division of the State Architect, to share their expertise and establish a common understanding and really hopefully provide some clarity as we go forward. And, a big piece of that, though, going forward, we do want to keep the dialogue going. So from your experience on the ground, we want to learn from it so that, if we do find creative solutions, it can be shared with others, and so we can all, benefit from it. It's really kind of that rising tide that lifts all boats type of approach. But fundamentally, at the core of today's discussion, we're balancing today's discussion, and also, but in this concept in general, we're balancing really kind of 2 key Californian values. It's accessibility and the services, for new technology, and the early growth of a market in its infancy. And, as California, we have the largest electric vehicle market, zero emission vehicle market in the country. And it puts us in a leadership position, a lot of it because of what Governor Brown's been doing. So we're also leading in this context as well, as far as meeting the federal standards for accessibility and also deploying infrastructure to meet our deployment targets and everything. So that's really the crux of it, the balance that we're aiming to strike. And we're very excited to hear, to have DSA here to present. So I wanted to, with that, kind of kick it over to Ida Clare, who is the principal architect at the Division of the State Architect. I guess that's kind of redundant in a way, but, but thank you very much, Ida. So she'll go through the presentation and we'll go from there.
Is this the, yep.
So there's the
Awesome.
thing there.
All right. Hello, thanks for coming today. We're really excited to have this presentation for you and assist in getting you familiar with the EV charging regulations in California. I'm Ida Clare, Principal Architect here at the Division of the State Architect. I am joined today by Derek Shaw, Senior Architect in the Access Codes and Standards Division. We have the authority, the Division of the State Architect Access Codes and Standards Unit has the authority under Government Code 4450 to provide accessibility regulations for public accommodations, public buildings, commercial buildings, and public housing. And so when we write those regulations are placed in Chapter 11B of the California Building Code. Today's discussion is an overview of the requirements. We encourage you to read the actual requirements that are in the California Building Code and become familiar with them so that in your discussions of implementation with your clients, constituents, that you really understand all the requirements that are required in the regulatory language. I just wanted to let you know that DSA has an electric vehicle charging station page on the website where you can download this presentation. I believe a link was sent to you. And as well on that page below the presentation, there's a link to the Building Standards Commission website and the codes. So you can actually click on that link and get the entire Chapter 11B and CALGreen, so you can read the requirements that are in CALGreen and the CBC for electric vehicle charging stations. Also, I wanted to let you know that the supplement that was provided to you, we have supplied those regulations to you, but Chapter 11B should be consulted in its entirety for all accessibility provisions. You will notice there are references there to other sections of 11B for operable parts, point-of-sale devices that are not included in this supplement, and so you will need to refer to Chapter 11B to get those requirements that are associated with those component systems if they're provided. So I do want to hand over to Derek right now, who will discuss an overview of the federal requirements for accessibility and the foundation of how we establish California requirements for accessibility to electric vehicle charging.
Great, thanks, Ida. Hi, good day to everybody here in the room and everybody out on our broadcast as well. I'm glad to be able to help out to convey some information on electric vehicle charging station accessibility. To a lot of people, the accessibility requirements seem like a new requirement that maybe came out of the blue. And for the building code, within the context of the building code, it is true that the building code requirements just became effective this past January. So in that context, yes, they are new. Our office went through approximately a 2-year process in developing the regulations and in writing various drafts of the code and vetting them before the public throughout this 2-year process. But really what led up to our efforts to write this into the building code were the existing accessibility requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, that was put into effect back in the early 90s. The ADA includes standards, construction standards for accessible design, and these construction standards generally apply to all types of public accommodations, and that's privately owned facilities that are open to the public in general, and also to governmental facilities. And that would be governmental facilities, either state facilities or city or county facilities. Okay, so that's kind of the breadth of the ADA and its coverage. The Title II under the ADA is the section that addresses state and local governments. And Title II covers all the activities of state and local governments, regardless of the government entity's size or receipt of federal funding. Title II requires that state and local governments give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities. Okay? There's another part of the ADA called Title III, and that's the portion that addresses public accommodations. Now, Title III covers businesses and nonprofit service providers that are public accommodations. In other words, privately operated entities offering certain types of courses and examinations, privately operated transportation, and commercial facilities. Public accommodations are private entities who own, lease to, or operate facilities such as restaurants, retail stores, hotels, movie theaters, private schools, convention centers, doctors' offices, homeless shelters, transportation depots, zoos, funeral homes, daycare centers, recreation facilities, including sports stadiums and fitness clubs. Additionally, transportation services provided by private entities are also covered by Title III. Okay. So you can see that Title III of the ADA has quite a broad scope, and it has been in effect, as I say, since the early 1990s. Okay. Now, the ADA in itself is the overall law, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the ADA standards for accessible design are the standards for construction that are included as part of this federal law. Okay. Now, the ADA standards cover quite a bit of detail, both in describing the types of the requirements that are applicable to different types of facilities, as well as then the detailed requirements that get into aspects as finite as the door hardware on doors as you go through these buildings, the entrance to the buildings, the connections, the accessible routes, the surfaces we walk on or people who use wheelchairs roll on, that go between the bus stops and the entrances to facilities, the parking areas, the accessible parking. We've all seen the accessible parking. Usually it's near the front door. It's got the blue sign with a wheelchair symbol on it. You know, these are all aspects that are required under federal law now. Now, with the division of the state architects, part of our role under California law is to incorporate requirements for accessibility, including the federal requirements. Now, the federal requirements that we look to from our office are primarily those that are in the ADA standards for accessible design. Now, the broader coverage of the ADA as a law extends much more generally, okay? And in general, what that tells us is that where a governmental entity is providing a benefit, it could be a program, it could be a service, that they have to do so in an accessible fashion. This has been federal law since the early 90s, as I mentioned. When we're in public accommodations, you know, the commercial facilities and the other long laundry list that I was speaking of, that they need to provide their goods and services in an accessible fashion. So when a store provides shopping, they're providing goods and the availability of these goods to people who have various types of disabilities is required under federal law. Okay, and so the overall legal structure of the ADA has covered all of these different types of goods and services, as well as benefits that are provided by governments. This would include the electric vehicle charging. Now, typically, electric vehicle charging, you're going to run into that either being provided by a governmental entity, and so they're covered under Title II of the ADA, or it's going to be being provided by a private entity, like a store or a shopping center. And so that has already been covered under Title III of the ADA. Now, what becomes a little bit tricky is how to apply these overall requirements to the construction of EV charging stations. Okay, the ADA standards, the construction standards under the ADA, they don't mention electric vehicle charging stations at all. It's no surprise. The ADA standards were crafted and passed back in 1990 originally, and really there just weren't too many electric vehicles at that time, let alone a broad network of charging stations that we see now being deployed throughout the state, throughout the country, and throughout the world. But nonetheless, conceptually, they were already covered by the federal standards. So there have already been obligations to provide accessibility at these facilities which provide electric vehicle charging, either through the government or as a public service, through the private entities. Now, how is this addressed currently under the federal standards? Well, it's a little bit murky, but the courts have given us good reinforcement to the general concept that's provided in the ADA, that where the goods and services or the governmental programs are provided, that accessibility is required. Now, the ADA standards address a lot of very specific construction requirements, as I mentioned, but they don't mention electric vehicle charging stations. Now, typically, the opinion of the Attorney General under the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, is that where a covered, where a government is providing a program, or where a public entity is providing goods or services, that even if it's not covered under the standards for construction, the ADA standards, that nonetheless that the owners or the government entity has an obligation to provide accessibility in some manner. Okay. Now, a lot of times that comes about by comparing the construction standards under the ADA standards and looking for elements that are similar to an unregulated and unmentioned element, such as electric vehicle charging stations. So what we see in the ADA standards is that they do certainly regulate parking spaces, and we look to those and we say, hey, those are similar. We've got a vehicle that pulls into a physical space, and so it is likely that a electric vehicle charging station that incorporates the federal standards for parking space size can apply that appropriately for the similar element in an electric vehicle charging station. Okay. Now, additionally, when we look at the ADA standards for accessible design, we see that they do cover controls. We see that they also cover automated sales interactions, consumer controls, where a person may purchase a ticket or to a public transportation, for example. And so we start to see that those elements are kind of similar to the controls that we see now in the electric vehicle charging station. Okay, so while the ADA standards don't expressly address electric vehicle charging stations, we can see that there can be some provisions that are already in the ADA standards that regulate and give good requirements for those different types of facilities. Now, the ADA standards is under the federal law. Okay, now what we do here at DSA is we incorporate the accessibility requirements into the California Building Code. And so in our process leading up to this, we did refer quite extensively to the ADA standards, as well as our existing California Building Code requirements that we already had with regard to parking and controls and accessible routes and those sorts of connections. Those have been incorporated, and you see those in the new regulations that are coming into effect. Now, some people will say, well, when the ADA standards does not cover an element specifically and explicitly, do we really have a requirement to do so? Well, I mentioned that yes, the Attorney General in the Department of Justice has given the opinion that yes, they do. Furthermore, it's been confirmed under the court case Fortune versus the City of Lomita. Now, this is not with regard to electric vehicle charging stations, but I think you can get an idea of the kind of obligation that the courts see for elements that are not explicitly called out in the federal ADA standards. Okay, and I'll just go ahead and read a little excerpt here. I think this is also in the package that was emailed out earlier. But in Fortune versus City of Lomita, the Circuit Judge Paez said that in this case, we must decide whether Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act requires local governments to provide accessible on-street parking in the absence of regulatory design specifications for on-street parking facilities. We hold that it does. And then in conclusion, in that same case, they say that the text of the ADA, the relevant implementing regulations, and the DOJ's interpretation of its own regulations all lead us to conclude that public entities must ensure that all normal governmental functions are reasonably accessible to disabled persons, irrespective of whether the DOJ has adopted technical specifications for the particular types of facilities involved. Accordingly, we hold that Fortune has sticking with. And so, anyhow, so you can see that legally we do have this concept of an obligation, even absent the specific technical requirements. In this case, they were talking about parking, but I think that very logically you can use that to understand the relationship then for accessible electric vehicle charging stations. Okay, and I think with that, go ahead and turn it back over to Ida, and I'll be back.
Thank you, Derek. So what's important for what Derek has covered is really a basic understanding that accessibility to electric vehicle charging stations is not optional. It's not optional under the federal standards. It's not optional now, obviously, under the state standards. What's very important, and you can also find in your supplement, is that a determination by the United States Access Board, the only guidance that they have provided on electric vehicle charging at the federal level is included in your supplement. It's one page. It's an example graphic. Those are not, that graphic is not regulatory. They're giving guidance and idea because there are no regulations in the standards. And so what's important to gather from that is one very, very important element that we have based our standards on. Charging is not parking. While a vehicle needs to be parked to charge, they are treated separately because charging is a service that a consumer is acquiring, just kind of like that bottle of shampoo. And parking is you need to arrive at the site in order to exchange and obtain those services. And so when individuals ask us, well, why can't we just put a charger at an accessible parking stall? Well, California law under the vehicle code restricts use of the parking stall, the accessible parking stall, for an unlimited amount of time and to individuals with a placard, generally free of charge, okay? And so you can imagine that if a charger is placed at an accessible parking stall, they do not have to have an electric vehicle. An individual with a disability that owns a parking placard does not have to have an electric vehicle to park there. So if an individual who does not have an electric vehicle is parking there, individuals with disabilities who have electric vehicles have no access to charging because the other space requirements that are there do not provide the required access. And so in order for equity, and as stated by the United States Access Board, you do have to treat them differently. So parking is parking, charging is charging, which is why it necessitates, a charging stall necessitates accessibility separate from parking. And so under the California Building Code and in our regulations, we make it very specific that the design of the parking facility is according to the parking regulations that are provided in the CBC, California Building Code, and the charging regulations are handled separately. And so when we state that they're handled separately, this is something that's not negotiable, okay? And it's not negotiable because we, in California, in our regulations, have to meet the minimum federal standard. And that's always the concept that gets kind of confused and traded, that California regulations, because they are specific to California, we're placing additional requirements over what the feds require. And that's actually not the case. We are required to meet the minimum federal standards, and generally with our regulations that we have put forth in the California Building Code, we are just making it specific. As Derek had mentioned, the ADA standards are not specific to electric vehicle charging. The ADA regulations overarching say you provide a good or a service, it's got to be accessible. California, because Governor Brown has this really ambitious goal of having all these electric vehicles available in the state and the charging infrastructure to support it, we have felt that there was a need to make it specific so that we could provide clarity to everyone in installing the charging stations and actually not put into jeopardy or liability business owners and city and government who actually provide charging but don't think about providing accessibility to them because it's not specific. So that was the goal of our regulations, was to provide specificity. I do want to say that throughout, as far as we know, throughout the country and also throughout the world, we are unique. We are the only ones who actually have regulations for electric vehicle charging accessibility, specific to electric vehicle charging. And so in starting that, we will start with our presentation. This is Governor Brown's executive order. I'm not going to go into the detail with this because Tyson covered it. But in the California Building Code, or the California Building Standards Code, the California Building Standards Code covers the electrical code, the building code, the green code, the mechanical code, there's the fire code, there's a lot of components. I'm going to be discussing two today that relate to electric vehicle charging, infrastructure and physical requirements. I'm going to start with the CalGreen code. So as of January 1st of this year, the California Green Code, the CalGreen is what we call it, requires charging infrastructure to be provided for all new construction projects. That does not mean that the chargers need to be installed. It just means that charging infrastructure needs to be provided and considered at the initial stages of new construction so that you can actually go and develop the charging capacity later on in the project, and you don't have to, it doesn't make it as difficult. And so it requires infrastructure and EV spaces for new multifamily residential facilities and non-residential facilities. An EV space is under CalGreen, an EV space, when we talk about EV spaces, is a space intended for future installation of EV charging equipment, because CalGreen only deals with infrastructure. It doesn't deal with physical space requirements. And that, just a reminder that there's no requirement for EV spaces to be constructed or available until the chargers are actually installed, okay? So in CalGreen, there's specific definitions. So when these terms are used in the CalGreen requirements, you should really look to the definitions about what these individual definitions, they do align with our building code definitions, but it's important to, when you're using the use of the code, to look at these definitions so that we know what we're putting in reference what we're talking about when you find this language. And I'm not going to go over it extensively, but the charging station is the charger, the space, and everything that's provided for a future installation under CalGreen. And the electric vehicle supply equipment is usually the mechanisms that supply the infrastructure. Okay, so under multifamily residential, this is what we're talking about now. It applies to new facilities that have 17 dwelling units or more, and EV spaces are calculated as 3% of parking spaces. So the local authority will say, local zoning requirements will say, for any new multifamily residential, you need to provide this many parking spaces, okay? And based on that number, now under CalGreen, 3% of those parking spaces need to be reserved for EV charging in the future. Okay, so you need to provide the infrastructure for 3% of whatever you're providing for parking. And at least one EV space shall be in a common use area and available for use by all residents. Then CalGreen, because they want to encourage people to be more green than just the minimum, they have what they call voluntary measures. And if you just go to Tier 1 and Tier 2, if any of you are familiar with the LEED building system and they have the certified silver, gold, platinum. Tier 1 and Tier 2 are similar to that in concept. So if you want to be more green than the minimum, these are voluntary. You can provide 5% of parking spaces for electric vehicle charging. Next. And so the mandatory measures for infrastructure is these electrical requirements. So the EV spaces, as they are designed, when EV chargers are installed. So in private multifamily residential facilities, now this means owned by a private owner. Under the building code, residential facilities are covered in two different sections. Chapter 11A deals with privately owned multifamily residential facilities. Chapter 11B deals with publicly owned housing available for public use, which we call for public housing. And I'm not going to get into extreme detail with that because it's a little technical, but your building official will help you determine, and as well as your owner, determine whether your facility you're addressing is private housing or public housing. But private housing, EV space shall be located adjacent to an accessible parking space with a shared access aisle. Again, it's not combined. It may have a shared access aisle, but it's not combined. They're separate. There's an EV space and there's a parking space. And then EV space shall be accessible according to the specified requirements in CalGreen and located on accessible routes. So in privately owned multifamily housing, there's minimal requirements specified in CalGreen for the space size. They are not in Chapter 11A. They may be coming in Chapter 11A in future code cycles, but right now they're handled 11B. In multifamily public housing facilities, EV spaces shall be provided in a public use and or common use area and accessible according to 11B scoping and technical requirements. Those are the regulations that we write, and so when it's a public housing facility, you follow Chapter 11B regulations, which are very specific, as we will discuss today. Next. Okay, so CalGreen gives us a table to determine for non-residential. So we just covered residential. Now this is your commercial facilities. This is your city parking garages. This is non-residential CalGreen measures. And they base the electric vehicle spaces required on this number. So if you have 0 to 9 parking spaces, you need to provide, sorry, I take it back. If you have 10 to 25 parking spaces provided, you are required to provide the infrastructure for one EV space. And then the number proceeds ahead of that. If you have over 201 parking spaces in any facility, this is new construction, you need to plan for 6% of spaces to be allotted for electric vehicle charging. Again, Tier 1 and Tier 2 are voluntary measures that just allow you to say you want to be more green, you would provide more spaces. But the minimum requires, their mandatory measures are 6% parking. Next. And so the mandatory measures in CalGreen tell you the type and location of the electric vehicle service equipment, and then again, the electrical requirements that are provided for non-residential construction. Next. And then, of course, the design of the electric vehicle charging stations, which is the space in the charger, are according to the requirements that I will now describe. And that's in Chapter 11B. It's divided into scoping and technical requirements. And these are the sections where you can find them, which is the excerpts that we have provided you today in the supplement. Next. Okay, so when you're planning electric vehicle charging, it's very important to take into consideration how your site will be used. And I just want to state that under electric vehicle charging, because it is a service and it's not parking, the accessibility provisions for parking require accessible parking on the shortest accessible route. That's why you always find them near the entrance. Electric vehicle charging stations are not required to be on the shortest accessible route. They are required to be on an accessible route, but they are not required to be near on the shortest entrance or closest to the entrance. You can take into consideration other site and topography conditions or proximity to electrical vehicle service equipment. You can take all those considerations as to where you are locating your electric vehicle charging stations on a site. What's very important, though, is there must be a connection to the entrance of the building if it's serving the building. There must be an accessible route from charging to the facility entrance. It's just not required to be closest to the entrance. Next. So we covered the federal requirements. Derek did briefly. To be specific, remember I said that private multifamilies in Chapter 11A, you would actually have to look at the Fair Housing Act requires accessibility, but it doesn't address electric vehicle charging because those requirements haven't been amended since 1988. And so you can look to the ANSI standard because that is the safe harbor for the Fair Housing Act if you want to determine how to address accessibility in private housing, okay? Next. In public housing and state and local government facilities and public accommodations and commercial facilities, Derek covered that access to goods and services is required. Next. And so we covered this early, Derek covered this, and I don't want to rehash it because I know that there's time constraints and I want to allow for your questions. But when you read this, this is just a reminder of the requirement of providing access under the federal requirements. Next. And so therefore, California provides access under 11B, and those requirements are specific. And this is our mission and why we do so that the clarity is there. And we actually protect you and we protect your clients in making sure that access is provided. Next. And so in addressing how we came up with our regulations, what's interesting about our regulatory process is very similar to that of the federal government. And it requires an outreach to stakeholders. So we started out with contacting a group of stakeholders, and we met regularly. I believe there was 8 meetings, Derek, where we discussed how are we going to provide access. And those stakeholders include individuals with disabilities, disability advocates, access professionals, building officials, architects, state agencies, charger manufacturers, electric utility companies, building industry representatives, and EV advocates. So a really wide, diverse group participated in developing these regulations. They are not done in a bubble by 3 or 4 of us in a state agency. We actually have a very open, transparent public process. We use a task force model for our stakeholder discussions, where we gather together individuals and just discuss what the options are, how we are going to handle it. From there, and those discussions, DSA writes the regulations. From there, we actually have to present them out for public comment again. So once the regulations are written, the public can provide comments on those, and we have an open comment process. And then once the comments are received and addressed, then we actually present our regulations to the Building Standards Commission, and they are adopted. So they were adopted last year, January 1st of last year, and they are now in effect as of January 1st of this year. So again, these regulations are not voluntary. They're not a good idea. They're not guidelines. They are regulatory, meaning this is the way you provide accessibility to charging in California. Now, as I stated before, other states do not have regulations. They're just using ADA guidance because it's not specific. But because we have such a formal process, the ADA considers a requirement of equivalent facilitation. And so knowing that California has gone through an excessive vetting process and stakeholder process to arrive at the regulations, other states can actually use California requirements as a guideline. It's not regulatory to them like it is in California, but because the process is so intensive that it could be equally considered as equivalent facilitation of providing the guidelines, and it kind of allows somewhat of a safe harbor that you're addressing accessibility in a manner that's really been seriously considered. So that's the benefit that our regulations actually provide beyond California. It's very important because under the federal guidelines, they only develop the regulations. It takes about 20 years for them to amend their standards. So the process to amend the 2010 standards started occurring right after 1990. So right now they're amending standards and probably won't issue a new amendment till 2030. Or, yeah, 2030, because it takes about 20 years. So until then, other areas, other states are trying to figure out how to provide accessibility, but California makes it specific. Next. And then, of course, this is just the timeline of the development of the regulations, but what's important is that they're effective now. Go ahead. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about accessibility regulations in specific. They're found in the California Building Code. Everything I'm addressing from here on out is in the California Building Code. Prior was CalGreen. This is in the Building Code. And the way the Building Code is used is you always start with definitions. We have a few definitions that are applicable to electric vehicle charging. Then you go to scoping, which is in Division 2, and you have those the scoping requirements also in your supplement, and that is in 11B228.3. Scoping tells you what type, how many, okay? And then, of course, there's technical. And the technical requirements really relate to the charging stations once, that it's not so much the how and when, it's actually how big, where are you located, how do you make it accessible? That's in Chapter 11B, Division 8, under Section 11B, 812. Next. These are the definitions. Again, like I said, they align with definitions in CalGreen. However, when these definitions are in the building code, this is when you are actually installing stations. So that's how these definitions vary a little bit differently than CalGreen. CalGreen is for when you are planning, and these definitions are when you're installing. Okay, so this is what's really important in understanding scoping. An electric vehicle does not need to charge every time it's parked. Therefore, public and common use electric vehicle charging stations are charging spaces and not parking spaces. While an EV needs to be parked in a state to charge, charging and not parking is the primary purpose of an electric vehicle charging station. And EV charging is a service provided by the facility owner or public entity and therefore must be accessible. Next. So local zoning codes may vary, and some jurisdictions may permit a facility owner to meet parking requirements with a combination of parking and charging, but accessibility requirements are handled differently. Okay, you have to provide accessibility to parking, and you have to provide accessibility to charging separately. And then, of course, where the provisions are located in the CBC. For parking, it's 208. For charging, it's in 228.3. Technical provisions for parking are in 502, and technical provisions for charging are in 812. And that's very important. We separated them in the code on purpose so that they wouldn't be confused and combined. Next. And so, again, understanding this, accessibility regulations do not require electric vehicle charging stations to be installed. When an owner chooses to provide them, they must be accessible, but there's no requirement to provide them. CalGreen may require you to provide infrastructure, but they don't even require you to provide the charging until you choose to do so. So understanding right now that a lot of this is voluntary. There are mandatory measures to repair, but there's no requirement right now still to provide charging. And when they are installed, accessible electric vehicle charging stations provided for common use, public use must meet scoping and technical requirements. Okay, next. So there are two exceptions to providing accessibility to electric vehicle charging, and this is in the building code. One are those not available to the general public and intended for use by designated vehicle or driver. So if you are in a multifamily housing facility, CalGreen requires you to put it in a common use area so that it's available for everyone who needs to use it. But if a resident wants electric vehicle charging, they can actually go to the facility owner and request that charging be provided at their assigned space if that individual does not have the need for an accessible charging. As long as it's assigned to a specific individual, then it wouldn't need to be accessible. The same for an employee. If that space is assigned specifically for one employee use, then it would not need to be accessible. If it's available for public use or common use, it would need to be accessible. So I covered both of those. And obviously private fleet vehicles. So if a company has electric vehicle fleet and they store them overnight, that's considered a storage facility, not a parking facility. And so therefore it wouldn't need to be accessible, or accessible spaces would need to be provided. Next. Okay, so remember under CalGreen, we talked about infrastructure needs to be provided and it's based on the number of parking spaces. Now when we go to Chapter 11B and we're actually installing the spaces, this table is based on the number of electric vehicle spaces. So where CalGreen says we need 3% of spaces, and say that number is 10 or 7, say 7. So you are now required by CalGreen to have 7 spaces based on your parking number. From this, you would go to this table and say, okay, I have 7 electric vehicle charging spaces. That means I require 1 accessible van, 1 standard accessible, but no ambulatory. So this is how you use this table. The tables are handled differently under CalGreen. It's based on parking. Here, it's solely treating the electric vehicle charging station number. And what's important is that where an EV charger can simultaneously charge more than 1 vehicle, the number of electric vehicle charging spaces is considered to the number of electric vehicles that can be simultaneously charged. Sometimes a charger has 2 connectors and serves 2 spaces. It's not based on the number of chargers, it's based on the number of spaces it can simultaneously serve. If they have 2 connectors and they don't serve 2 spaces, the charger is only given an option of the charge level, whether it's a charge level 2 or a charge level 3, but it only serves 1 space. That's considered 1 space, not 2 spaces. So it's important to address how much the charger can simultaneously charge and the space that you're provided to base this number. Next. Okay, so when new charging stations are added to a site with existing charging stations, the total number of new and existing is used to determine the number of the accessible. So we have stated that our electric vehicle regulations are applicable after January 1st of this year, which was 2017. And there are many electric vehicle charging stations installed, many of which did not provide access or did not address access. These regulations do not require you to go back and make those accessible because the regulations were not in effect. What should access have been provided? Yes, as we discussed, but our regulations under the CVC only address from January 1st of this year new construction and alterations. But we do consider that when you're looking at the total number being provided, the table that we just discussed does take into consideration any existing that are already installed. You can address access on the total number based on the new, so you don't have to retrofit the others, but the number is based on the total number that's provided. Technical provisions apply only to new and altered EVCS, and the CVC does not require existing charging stations to be altered. Operable parts on all new and altered EV chargers must comply with the requirements for operable parts, and that is a 5-pound force, 1-hand usage. Those requirements are in 309.4. Next. So our charging regulations address 4 different types: a van accessible charging space, a standard accessible charging space, an ambulatory space, and a drive-up space. And these requirements are in 812 and also in the supplement that's provided to you. Next. Okay, so I'm not going to get terribly into these. These only describe the space configurations for a van accessible, for each of the 4 spaces. What I do want to address, though, is that 12-foot space. If you recall parking, there is an option to provide either a 12-foot wide space with a 5-foot access aisle or an 9-foot wide space with an 8-foot access aisle. Electric vehicle charging is different. We require a 12-foot space with a 5-foot access aisle, and that's because the car can shift in that 12-foot wide space depending on where the connector is on the car. So they would park closer to the access aisle if the connector's on the driver's side, so that if they need access with a wheelchair or a mobility device, they can get it. If they have it on the other side, they can actually get greater access on the passenger side. And if they have an electric van, which are coming, and they have a chair lift in the van, then you have the 8-foot access aisle while parking closer to the left. So it does allow for flexibility. In that model that you have under the federal standards that you have in your supplement, you'll see that there's 2 access aisles with a narrower space. We just really mark 1 access aisle and allow that flexibility within the 12-foot space, but the space requirements are similar. Next. The standard space is typical to a standard accessible space, 9 by 18 with a 5-foot access aisle. This can be shared, so you can have a 12-foot wide van space, a 5-foot access aisle, which is required to be on the passenger side for a van space, but your next space could be 9 feet wide, and the access aisle can be on either side. So they could share an access aisle to have 2 accessible spaces. Next. Ambulatory accessible space. This kicks in when 26 or more EV charging spaces are provided. It is a 10-foot wide space that just gives a little more width for those to have a little bit more room to maneuver around a space if the accessible stalls are occupied. And so we take that into consideration to consider that we are trying to provide more use to accessible EV charging, because obviously if you need to charge, you're kind of stuck if you don't have that access. So we're trying to provide more access. And not all individuals who have a flat card have a wheelchair. I mean, many have other types of mobility devices that they need a narrower space where they can negotiate, but a little bit more wider than perhaps a standard parking space might offer. Next. And then a drive-up EV space is similar to a fuel pump. This is really when you'll use your level 3 charging, that you can charge a fast amount and you're usually waiting where you're charging. So similar to a gas station, you can drive up and charge. You're not necessarily going anywhere, but waiting for it. And so we call that the drive up. It is, in our definition, it is limited to 30 minutes maximum. So the design of the space is intended to be somewhere where there's a quick turnover and transfer. Next. And so these are more technical requirements. You know, having the no parking in the access aisle, which is similar, and that the markings on the vehicle surface say EV charging only. What's important to remember is that under parking, everyone's familiar with the ISA that's on the pavement marking. That is not provided in electric vehicle charging, because under the vehicle code, when the space is marked with the what we call the international symbol of accessibility, the blue square with the wheelchair symbol, when a parking space is marked with that, it is reserved for exclusive use and all day unlimited parking under the vehicle code. And so we can't use the same markings because in electric vehicle charging, it is not, we can actually set time limits. And so we can't mark it the same as we would parking. Plus the visual helps in determining that this is for charging, this is for parking. So on the accessible electric vehicle charging stations, the surface markings say only electric vehicle charging only. They don't have an ISA. Next. So there are accessible route requirements. An accessible route shall be provided connecting the EV space to the charger. That makes sense, right? That could be accommodated if it's up higher on a curb ramp, or it could be off the same level, but it needs to be a route that can be used by a wheelchair user according to the requirements in the code for what we call an accessible route. They need to be designed so that the cables don't obstruct the accessible route. So we do have a little bit of design flexibility where we show the chargers in the graphics, which you'll see in a minute coming up. Those are not where the chargers are required to be located. So that's just a representative example of you know, visual requirements of how a space could look meeting the requirements, and try to convey the requirements in a graphic form, but it's not exclusive. Where the space may be required and is regulatory, the location of the charger is not. But it must meet the requirements where it doesn't block the accessible route in an access aisle. Electric vehicle charging stations that serve a particular building or facility shall be located on an accessible route. Remember, I said it doesn't need to be the shortest, but it does need to connect. And then where they do not serve a particular building or facility, they shall be located on an accessible route to an accessible pedestrian entrance. And to think about this, this is like your city parking structures or city parking garages, which they don't serve a building, they just serve the city, the downtown area. those, since they don't have an accessible entrance to a specific building, they do need to provide an accessible route to exit the structure and get onto the sidewalk. Okay, next. A little bit about the chargers. Operable parts and charging port storage shall comply with the requirements for a clear floor space. That means that an individual who's using a wheelchair needs to be able to wheel up to the charger and have a clear floor space free of obstruction that's level, that they can actually use the parts and operate the parts. Reach range requirements. There are limitations as to where any of the buttons or the point of sale devices or any operable parts, is what we call them, are used, have to fall within specific reach ranges. And then there are operable parts requirements. Most parts on the charger need to meet a 5-pound force for operation, except for the electric vehicle connector, because just like gas station nozzles are exempt from that, so are electric vehicle connectors, because of the charge requirement that is that in order to get the connector to work. But point of sale devices also must comply with the required accessibility features. So in California, this is a specific California regulation for point of sale devices. All point of sale devices, wherever they are provided, must meet the requirements for the visually impaired. So the requirements for point of sale devices to have accessibility features do not extend only to the accessible electric vehicle charging stations. It extends to all electric vehicle charging stations that are provided. And that is because an individual who perhaps has visual impairments, maybe a passenger, may want to pay for the power that goes into the electric vehicle for the driver, but they may not need an accessible stall because their impairments are not mobility impairments. So all chargers need to meet the requirements for point of sale devices for that have the accessibility features, which are usually the features for the visually impaired or blind. EV charger requirements, this is where they're located. Again, the graphics do not specifically state where to locate them. You need to look at regulatory language, and it applies a little bit of flexibility so that you can have that design for whatever location that you need to look at. And your building official will make sure that you meet the requirements when you look to that. Next. Okay, so identification is important. As you know, as I stated previously, the ISA on the pavement and parking, the ISA above the parking stall reserves the space for unlimited use. And we have already stated that for 4 or less charging stations, they are not reserved. So you provide the space requirements, but there is no signage that requires then the space to be reserved exclusively for individuals with disabilities. Okay. Once you hit 5 charging stations, the van accessible space is reserved for those with the placard, and that's when it has the ISA at the front of the stall. Remember, no pavement markings, because that would make it a parking space, but the ISA at the head of the stall reserves it when you provide 5 or more. But when you have 5 or more, it kicks in another standard accessible space. That one is not reserved. So at that time, you still have that one flexible to be used by everyone, but the van accessible one would be reserved. Next. And then, of course, when you hit 26 or more, all accessible spaces that you have provided are reserved, and then you kick in a ambulatory space. And the ambulatory spaces are never required to be identified as accessible. You'll just see them as wider spaces and so everyone can use them. And then, of course, the drive-up EVCS, while it needs to have level areas so that people can maneuver around it, there's no striping, there's no signage for a drive-up EVCS. There are requirements for accessibility, but you don't really notice that they have any physical characteristics of an accessible stall, because it mostly extends to being able to provide an accessible route to the charger and a level area, and space requirements that are unmarked. Next. Okay, these are just a little bit about the signs that are provided. The van accessible stall does have to have a van accessible signage requirement once it's 5 or more and reserved. Next. Okay, so understanding that charging limits. Parking is unlimited. You can apply charging limits to an electric vehicle charging station, even the accessible ones. If it's usually if it's signed by the local ordinance. So you do have to check what the local ordinance requires in doing that. Next. And then now we just give a little bit of graphics on these sample layouts. So this is when you are having 2 electric vehicle charging stations. This is one that's available for use by all. There is no width requirement, and there's no signage requirement. This is the accessible one. We do have a width requirement, an access style depth requirement. It must say EV charging only, and then an accessible route to get to the charger. Again, the location of the charger is representative. It can be located farther back. It can be located, you know, you would play with that, and as long as you meet the requirements. Next. This is when you have 5. So here is the van accessible space. It's reserved with the sign. Here is the standard accessible space. That's why it says EV charging, but there is no signage, means it's available for use by all. It does have width requirements, and it does have the access style requirements, especially the no parking. But these other stations are not regulated in the accessibility provisions. They're electric vehicle charging stations, but those requirements are by local ordinance, if they have any. Next. And then, of course, when you hit 26 or more, so this is kind of cut off. We're obviously not showing 26 spaces here, but this illustrates the van accessible aisle with the reserved sign, the standard accessible with the reserved sign, because remember, 26 or more, all that you've provided accessible are reserved. And then, of course, an ambulatory, which is not reserved, but it does still say EV charging, and it's just a little bit wider. Next. And so I'm going to pass this on to Derek right now. We're almost done with our presentation. I addressed really a lot of new facilities, and those are easy to address these requirements because you're starting from scratch. But we do have some requirements in the building code that address when you put EV charging into existing facilities, and I'm going to pass that on to Derek.
Okay, so the next portion that I'm going to address is what happens in an alteration. An alteration is an alteration of an existing facility. And the term facility, you know, more specifically can address the EVCS facility, but in other parts of the code it addresses more broadly the facility, such as a site or a building. Okay. However, for the purposes of electric vehicle charging, when we see in the requirements of section 11B-202.4 that when alterations are made to existing buildings or facilities, an accessible path of travel, and that's a term of art, an accessible path of travel to the specific area of alteration or addition shall be provided. Okay. Now, path of travel as a term of art includes not only the accessible route to get there, but also toilet rooms that serve the area of alteration, telephones, the entrance to the building facility that serves the area of alteration. Okay. Now, if we can go to the next slide, please. And so, okay, so I've addressed this. I can go to the next slide. Now, there is an exception, and this is going to be really critical for EV charging. When you install new charging stations at existing facilities where vehicle fueling, charging, parking, or storage is a primary function, then the path of travel improvements are limited to 20% of the cost of work directly associated with the installation of EVCS. Okay, so that means in those cases that you are required to spend, if necessary, to bring them up to current code requirements, up to 20% maximum of the cost of the installation of the alteration, the installation of EVCS in this case. Okay. Now this is only going to apply then where the EVCS is in a parking structure or some other facility where the primary use of that facility is for fueling, charging, parking, or storage. Okay. Now, where do you have an alteration where the new EVCS is being installed in a location where the primary function of the overall facility is not fueling, charging, parking, or storage, like at a shopping center, at a business office, any of the examples that are not primarily parking or fueling, then you have no path of travel improvement obligations at all. You're completely exempted from them. The accessible route requirements to get you to the entrance of the facility, or as Ida had mentioned earlier, to the public walk, if there is no associated building, then those are still going to be there. Those are accessible routes, but those are different than the path of travel obligation. Okay, so on the one hand, if you go into a city parking garage, okay, now a city parking garage, if it stands alone, then that is the primary function of that space, is parking. Okay, so that's gonna fall into this first bullet point here, because that becomes a primary function for parking. Okay, so in this case, you do need to provide improvements to the toilet rooms if there are any provided. If there aren't any, you don't have to build new toilet rooms. But if you have toilet rooms there, you need to make sure that they're accessible and that the accessible route extends to those areas as well. If, on the other hand, you're installing in a parking structure that is associated with an office building, now on that site, the office building conducting business is the primary function of that site, and it's not parking. Parking may be provided, but generally that's provided to support the primary function of conducting business in your office building. So in that case, you get the full exception, and you have no path of travel obligation in that case. Okay, and please make note of Section 11B 202.4, Exception 10. That was written specifically for electric vehicle charging stations and their installation. We can go to the next, please. Okay, so we've written our scoping provisions consistent with the guidance from the U.S. Access Board. I think I've conveyed that information basically in the prior slide. We can go to the next.
Can I interrupt a second?
Yes, of course.
What that basically said is that when you have an improvement in an office building, and that you provide both on your site, you have both charging and parking, that parking is a site arrival post, so an improvement in that office building may trigger improvements to the parking area, but it will not trigger improvements to a charging station area for a project that occurs within the building. Path of travel is applied to all alteration projects under the California Building Code, which are those elements of path of travel from the site, from parking, from bathrooms. We're just saying that because parking and charging is different, that when you're doing an alteration inside the building official is not going to make you upgrade both charging areas and parking areas, only parking areas. So that's also an additional exception.
Yes.
Sorry, I wanted to clarify that.
Yes, that's incorporated. Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Ida.
You're welcome. That was what that slide was about. It's just a little confusing to read it.
Okay. Now, all alterations under the building code, alterations to existing facilities, they are subject to technially infeasible or technical infeasibility, and you'll see that in Section 11B-202.4. What that does is it tells us that the alteration has to comply with the requirements of the code. And if they can't comply with the requirements of the code for the purposes that would be determined to be a technical infeasibility, that's determined by the building department. So again, it's good to work with the building department early in your planning stages. Then the obligation is to comply with the requirements of the code through equivalent facilitation or to the greatest extent feasible. Okay. Unreasonable hardship does not apply to the path of travel improvements triggered by EVCS because the path of travel improvements are already limited to 20% of the adjusted construction cost. That's for other types of construction projects other than EVCS. A lot of times the unreasonable hardship provision is invoked. It's kind of similar to the exception that is provided in the first paragraph of exception 10 for EVCS. So you can't pile one exception on top of the other. Okay. For EVCS, look to exception 10. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we can go to the next one. Thank you.
Can I just add a little bit to that? So just to make it kind of in layman's language, when you're thinking of technical and feasibility, it's something structural and physical that prevents you from installing. When you're thinking of unreasonable hardship, it's when you're addressing path of travel that costs are prohibitive because the cost to provide these improvements are greater than the cost of the project. Mm-hmm. Your building official will help you interpret those requirements specifically, but there are terms that are defined in the building code, so look to the building code to determine how they're used and to consult your building official because we know that they're quite technical. Sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting.
No, I think that's great, and that's exactly where we are. Here we include the definition of technically infeasible here, and so you can review this, but as Ida said, it means in an alteration it has little likelihood of being accomplished because existing structural conditions require the removal of load-bearing members. You got a column in the way, you can't do anything about it. You can't move the column. You could re-engineer it, but that's very, very extravagant in cost. So you're not required under the building code to go that route. Because, and this might apply more to EVCS, because other existing physical or site constraints prohibit modification or addition of elements, spaces, or features that are in full and strict compliance with the code. That might include legal limitations to construction. Maybe you've got of course, the boundary of the site is a legal limitation. You can't be obligated to construct outside of your own site, or you may have power lines that cross over the site, and you may be prohibited from constructing under the area where the power lines are. So these are some examples of legal constraints that might impact your projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so the key here is that the determinations of technically infeasible by the building official are addressed on a case-by-case basis. In other words, the building official looks at every single project individually to determine if there are technical infeasibilities. Now, most building departments will require the applicant to say, hey, building official, we've got an issue here. We think this is a technical infeasibility, and these are the reasons why we believe, the substantiation that we believe this is a technical infeasibility. And then you request the determination by the building official to determine that it is, in fact, a technical infeasibility. Okay, and I mentioned before, you provide equivalent facilitation or comply with the requirements to the maximum extent feasible. Okay. The building official is going to make their notes, their recording of their determination, and they're required under the building code to retain that determination and the substantiation for it. So they're going to take your request, which identifies the reasons why you believe there's technical infeasibility. They're going to put it together with their determination. They're going to put it in the files, or they're going to save it on their hard drive. We can go to the next one, and that's it. Okay.
And this is my contact information as well. If you have additional questions, email or call.
We'll leave this up here for a while.
We're at the end of our time, a little bit over, in fact, and we just want to thank everybody for your attention and questions. And we have a lot more questions to answer. But the big thanks to DSA and Ida and Derek for their time today and their availability.
Thanks for coming.
And make sure you connect with them and their building officials with them as questions come up.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thanks.